Welcome to my channel, where the scariest stories come to life. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you never miss a story. Now, let's get into the horror. I'm a 25-year-old woman. This happened a couple of weeks before Christmas. I lived in a small apartment in the city at the time, but worked in an office farther out in the suburbs. My shifts were kind of all over the place, sometimes being early morning, sometimes being extremely late into the night. This was one of the nights where I got out at around 11 p.m. or so. I was the very last to leave the office, so I locked up when I left, then walked out into the snow to my car. I guess it had been snowing for quite a while, because there was about an inch or so on the ground, and it was completely covering my windshield. I did my best to wipe it off and then let my car heat up. Eventually, I began the long drive home. I had to drive very slowly, as the roads hadn't been plowed yet, so there was a good amount of snow on them. A couple of times, even with my carefulness, my car lost traction for a second, sending me into a little panic before it jerked back under control. It was a constant balance of trying to drive slowly and carefully, but not so slow that it would take 2 hours to get home. Only 20 minutes into the drive, though, my car lost traction again and just would not recover and stop sliding. I slid all the way into a snowbank on the side of the road, angled slightly downward into a ditch. It actually happened very slowly, slow enough that there was no real damage involved. Still, though, there was no way back out. I threw my hat back on and stepped out of my car. It had basically sunk right into the ditch and was covered in snow almost up to the doors. I put my face into my hands, extremely frustrated at the inconvenience. I knew I was going to have to call for roadside assistance. Before I got back into my car, though, I noticed some headlights coming down the road, slowing down and eventually stopping right next to me. It was a regular-looking silver truck. They rolled down the window, and whoever was inside called out to me, "Hey, you need any help? I can tow you out if you need." "Yeah, that would be great. I'd really appreciate it," I said. It was hard to pass up on saving a $200 towing fee and possibly waiting hours for them to arrive. The man inside said to give him 5 minutes to go grab his tow hitch from his garage, then he quickly drove off. Nearly freezing already, I climbed back into my car. I wasn't expecting them to have to go back home to get what they needed. When they'd offered to help me, it seemed like a huge inconvenience just to help some random person. From our short interaction, it was hard to tell if I could trust them or not. Maybe they weren't even going to come back at all, or maybe they would come back and help me. Hard to know for sure. I think the longer I sat there and waited, though, the more unsure I felt about this. Maybe I should have just called roadside assistance, just in case. I really felt like I'd put myself in a bad position here, just in case the guy never actually came back. I was startled out of my thoughts by a loud knocking on the side window. There was someone standing out there staring in at me. It was a man with 2 thick jackets on and a scarf covering most of his face. I cracked the window down a bit, assuming he was the man who wanted to help me, but he didn't say anything. He just looked at me from the bit of his face showing. His skin was very pale, like he'd been out in the cold for quite a while. I'm all right. I've got help on the way already. They should be here any minute." "But thank you," I said, trying to get this guy to leave me alone. They didn't acknowledge me at all, though. Honestly, I wasn't too sure what to do. That was, until I heard a click as he tried to open the door. It took me a moment to realize that's what I just heard. Before I could react and roll up the window, he jammed his arm in through the crack and unlatched the lock. I tried to grab the door, but he swung it open and leaned into the car. I tried pushing and kicking, but this guy was way bigger than me. Pretty much, he just grabbed my arms and began dragging me across the front seat and out into the snow. I was doing everything I could to wrestle my way out of his grip, but he was forcing me further away from the road and out into the woods. Just when I was running out of fight in me, headlights lit up the entire area, blinding us both. A man yelled out from the road and scared the man away. He ran straight off into the woods, quickly fading away into the darkness. I was dizzy, trying to catch my breath after the fight. The man helped me up and back to the road, giving me his jacket to keep me warm. It was then that I saw his silver truck and noticed it was the man who'd offered to help me before. He really did come back for me. The rest of that night felt like a real blur. The man called the police for me and gave his witness statement as well. I really don't know what would have happened if he hadn't gone out of his way to help me like that. I probably wouldn't even be here right now to tell my side of the story. This happened around 4 years back. It was the middle of winter, and the night was unseasonably warm, without a hint of snow on the ground. I left my apartment around 8 p.m. to go for my daily walk. I worked nights, and my schedule was screwed up because of that, hence the late night walk. I figured I would cross the bridge into the city nearby. For a bit more context, I'm a fairly tall guy who's somewhat athletic, and I was in my late 20s at the time. I'd never really had a problem walking at night, and at the time, I felt very safe to do so. I put on my headphones and headed toward the bridge. The first 20 minutes were uneventful. I passed by old houses, a subpar Mexican restaurant, a really good Mexican restaurant, and a sketchy gas station. Finally, I arrived at the river. Enjoying the bright lights over the dark flowing water, I crossed the bridge into the city and hit the crosswalk button at a 4-way intersection. That was when I noticed someone standing on the corner opposite from me, the only other person I'd seen outside at all that night. Seemingly, she was doing nothing. I assumed she was waiting for an Uber to come pick her up or something, since she didn't seem to be waiting for the light to change at all. The street, which was ordinarily busy during the daytime, was very silent. The light changed, and I started to cross, headed in her direction. As I neared her, I noticed she kept casting glances my way, then looking away almost instantly, like she was shy or something. She did this multiple times, and I figured maybe she was just intimidated by me or something. I sympathized. It makes you uneasy, being the only two people on a dimly lit street. As I passed by, I took in her outfit, mostly because I thought it looked a little cold. She was wearing clothes that were way too thin for the winter, some jeans, and a plastic children's backpack on her back. I thought she must have been in her teens at first, but upon closer inspection, she appeared to be in her late 20s or early 30s. She was skinny and of average height. Looked like a normal girl, really. I walked by and continued down the street. I walked by some high-rise hotels on my left and right and made my way into a Central Park area. During peak hours, this place would be packed with tourists and locals alike. But at that odd hour, and with the pandemic in full swing, it felt like I was the only man in the city, almost. I admired the display of lighted trees, figuring I was at a good halfway point or so in my journey. I made my way around an old marble and stone library and started back toward the bridge. As I turned the corner of the library and went back down the street I'd come from, I nearly collided with someone who was moving toward me. It was the same woman I'd seen not 10 minutes ago. My noise-canceling headphones were still on, so I pulled them down to one side and said something by way of apology. Instead, she stepped back from me and stood below a streetlight, refusing to make eye contact. She kept stealing tiny glances at me, the same thing I had noticed her doing before. I put my headphones back on, said, "Not a good night," and headed toward the nearest crosswalk. Reason told me she must be headed in the direction I'd come from, since we'd nearly run into each other going opposite ways. But another part of me whispered that something wasn't right. Maybe she wasn't headed that way. After all, sure enough, I turned around to glance behind me and saw her trailing right there. Her stride was surprisingly sneaky. I found this behavior suspicious enough that I continued to watch her out of the corner of my eye. After I reached the crosswalk once more, I stood there waiting for the light to change. She caught up with me, but passed me by, then stopped and looked as if she were pretending to do something. A car went past, briefly blocking her from view. As it did so, she squatted over a plastic bag a few meters from me, rifling through it for something. She began to look up at me on occasion. I stopped my podcast so I could hear what was going on better. What I found most disturbing about the motion of her searching through her bag is that it became clear to me that she was pretending to do this. For some reason, she was barely looking inside, just waving her hand about aimlessly all while looking at me. Something felt wrong here. The light changed, and I began to walk more quickly. She stood up suddenly, running toward me. I braced myself, but to my surprise, she darted past me and toward the museum, swinging the half-open little pink backpack over her shoulder. I watched her silhouette disappear into the darkness, beyond the reach of any streetlights. I hoped that would be the end of that strange encounter, and after a few beats of not seeing her, I let my guard fall a little, restarting my podcast. Beyond the museum, in the area which she had fled to, there was a patch of very poorly lit sidewalk. It wasn't far from the bridge, actually. As I had to make my way through that area, I turned my head to look at the reflections of the buildings. To my horror, though, I could barely make out in the reflection of the front of one of those buildings a dark figure sprinting quietly toward my reflection. I'm not sure why, maybe out of sheer confusion, but I turned towards her as she hurtled toward me. Perhaps surprised by me suddenly turning around, she halted mere feet away from me, staring at me. Her eyes were wide and frantic, completely wild-looking. She kept looking at my arms, then back at my face, as though sizing up whether she could take me or not. I puffed up my chest, and it seemed my accidental bluff had worked in the darkness. I suppose I must have looked more prepared to fight back in the moment than I felt. I could see she was gripping some sort of weapon tightly in one hand, holding it off to the side in the shadow of the building. I couldn't tell exactly what it was. It may have been a knife or something. Seconds dragged on as we stood there, now locked in a stalemate of staring at one another, immobilized by fear and confusion. I waited for her to make her move and attempt to use the object she held in her hand on me. To my enormous relief, though, a car went past us. A bit of my strength returned in that moment, and I began to shout at her, "What do you want from me?" No reply. I slowly backed away from her, expecting her to keep following me. She just watched me with this intense look on her face. I took another step back, then another. I kept backing away from her until I felt confident enough to turn around and carefully walk away. As I reached a better lit area, I began to run away faster, all while keeping my eyes trained on her shadowy, lingering form. She continued to follow me for some time. Abruptly, having spontaneously abandoned whatever plans she may have had for me, she turned around and, without even looking for traffic, ran across a street with some long strides. She disappeared around the corner of a building. Something about how casually she behaved kind of disturbed me. I kept my eyes trained behind me on the rest of the walk home, afraid she would pop out again at any moment. The bridge was well lit, thankfully, and I saw no sign of her. Knowing that this was the only way for her to attempt to follow me and keep up on foot, I breathed a huge sigh of relief. I saw no more cars headed out from the city and no more pedestrians out walking the rest of the way. Nothing happened after that. I'm not sure why, but I didn't call the cops that night. I still regret having not called them, despite my roommates insisting I do so. I just remember thinking that I wasn't sure what to say to the cops. I hadn't necessarily been attacked. They wouldn't have been able to find her anyway. I made up excuses like that to myself. I suppose I must have been in shock and denial of having been nearly ambushed at night, especially by someone smaller than me and in my own city, so close to my home. One of my roommates did call the cops anyway. A cop drove through the area, but by that point, she was long gone. A few years ago, my wife and I were going to my parents' house for Thanksgiving. It's a tradition to gather up there, and my parents have a decently sized house. It's only about 10 to 15 minutes away. Most of the way there is through quiet and winding roads. I remember that we left sometime late morning. It was very nice and sunny out as we drove through those quiet, winding roads. We were looking forward to seeing all the people that would be there. Aside from my parents, there would also be lots of other extended family members that we didn't always get to see all the time. However, when we had made it within just a few minutes of my parents' place and were just outside their neighborhood, something strange occurred. We were driving past an extremely dense wooded area to the right of the road. As we did, we saw this man up ahead, seemingly stumbling out of the woods and walking right out into the center of the road. He stopped and faced us, just standing there. The man appeared to be younger and was wearing a sweatshirt and jeans. He had long hair and a patchy-looking beard. Needless to say, it was quite a strange thing to see. I had to slow down significantly after noticing him. My wife and I were wondering what this guy was doing. I had to come to a near stop, and that's when the man waved at me and started walking over to my driver's side window. I remember that before I'd even rolled the window down or stopped completely, my wife said not to let him in. He looked like quite a sketchy guy and was clearly trying to get my attention. For some reason, I stopped and rolled down the window, wondering what he could possibly want. He said hi to us at first and then asked if we could give him a ride. He claimed that he just wanted to get down to the gas station. There was one that was a little ways down the road in the opposite direction. We weren't headed that way, though, and like I said before, the man was fairly sketchy. I told him that I could not help him. The man began to plead with me, saying it was not that far away. Still, I said no. I did ask, however, if he had a phone or wanted me to call somebody to come help him, but he declined immediately. At that point, with the man still standing there next to my driver's window, I started to drive away. I wondered what exactly his story was but continued on anyway. The rest of the drive to my parents' home didn't take that much longer at all. After arriving, we went inside and started talking and hanging out with everyone else. I remember at one point asking a few people who got there after us if the man had stopped them in the road too, or if they'd seen anybody else at all. Nobody else said they saw him, though. As Thanksgiving went on, at one point, I was standing near the front side of the living room in my parents' home when I happened to glance out the window and noticed that a man was walking down the street. It looked a heck of a lot like the guy we'd just seen earlier that day. He was walking very slowly, just kinda looking around like he was lost. Eventually, he wandered out of my sight, and I soon forgot about him again. Later on in the evening, when it was now completely dark out, I remember hearing a sudden knock at the door. Everyone was wondering who it could be, because everybody who was invited was already there. Somebody else walked over to the door and looked out but did not open it. I remember them saying that some random guy was standing out there. My parents got called over, asking if they knew the man. I walked over as well. I remembered the man I had seen earlier. When we all got to the window, sure enough, it was the exact same man. I told them not to answer the door, saying this guy was extremely sketchy and had asked me for a ride hours earlier. The man stood there at the doorstep for a few moments before turning to walk away, but he did not walk back toward the street. Instead, it looked as though he was starting to make his way around to the back of the house. At that point, one of my uncles opened up the front door slightly and yelled at the man, asking what he thought he was doing. The man stopped on a dime, turned around, and ran back out into the street. He quickly disappeared into the night. For the rest of the night, we didn't see him at all. I really don't know who that guy was or what he was trying to do, but it was very sketchy indeed. Thankfully, I didn't give him a chance to do anything bad. Thanks for sticking around till the end. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to give the video a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a terrifying tale. See you in the next one.